Hi everyone, I'm Joshua Schultz. Welcome to a brief lecture on learner characteristics and influences on language learning. You should automatically hear my voice as the slides advance. However, if you don't, for some reason, you may be prompted to hit a icon that typically appears in the right-hand corner of your slides. Let's begin. The objective of our modules is for us to integrate some of our own thoughts about language learning and explore how they are how they play out in our classroom. So we'll examine some of the cognitive, personality, and sociocultural factors that influence language learning and gain a deeper depth of understanding about how those factors play out in our own teaching of English as a new language. To start your thinking, it's important to do some self-assessment and examining some of the issues related to the factors that influence language learning. Take a moment to look at Lightbound and Spider's work on 76 and 77. There are a number of questions related to the influences on language learning. I'd like you to just take a moment to think about them. You may pause this slideshow for a moment and answer those questions, just to get your thinking started. Welcome back. Let's talk a little bit about the cognitive factors that influence language learning. There are a few. This big one is probably the one a lot of us associate with language learning. We think about the multilanguage learner as being pretty intelligent, but what are the impacts of intelligence on second language learners? What do you think in second language learning? Fred Genesee, who has spent many years in studying language learning factors and intelligence and aptitude, concluded in his 1976 study that indeed those with a higher IQ did perform better in language learning. But wait a minute, are we going to accept that without being critical? Of course not. We have to think about the cultural biases that are inherent in IQ tests, and we know that matching the test to the learner is something that has been critically examined over the last 40 years or so. So, IQ tests have cultural bias. They're, looking for particular things, and they are not considering what Gardner called the multiple intelligences, right? The intelligence of art, intelligence of communication, etc., etc., etc. So we have to be a little bit critical about the way we think about intelligence. What about language learning aptitude? So there are a battery of aptitude tests, such as the MLAT and the Pimsleur Language Aptitude Battery, in which students are asked to identify sounds, function words, and to memorize chunks of phrases, etc. And they've been found that students that have a strong, quote-unquote, strong aptitude perform better on those tests and vice versa. But we have to think, again, what are those tests examining? So we found that, for example, in the area of memorization, they found that if you have a very good working memory, a short-term memory, then you did pretty well on your language learning aptitude tests. If you were someone that was highly analytical, you did pretty well in things that were that required examination of grammar, for example. If you were someone who was good at memorizing, you also were someone who was pretty good at working up through the functional aspects of language. Primary language development is a cognitive factor that is going to influence your language learning. So those students who have a strong first language, who have strong oral language skills, or strong literacy in their L1, their first language, have been found to be better second language learners. The influence of language, first language, and its transfer to a second language has also been explored. There's this whole idea of contrastively analyzing languages to see how one is more similar to another. We may think about a Portuguese speaker learning Spanish. They may have there's some built-in advantages because of the similarities in the language. So if they're literate in Portuguese, they might be able to display strength in learning a second language that's a Romance language. The last one is age, and age. We all have had, kind of think about children having an advantage, or the adage is that children have an advantage at learning language, but you're going to think that they have more time. There's not less demand in language, but there's typically less complex tasks required for a child to learn a language. And there are less expectations of perfection from a child than there is from an adult. So there are a lot of sociocultural factors that are influencing. And as we go through the cognitive factors, personality factors, and sociocultural factors, I recognize that all of these things overlap. So you can be a successful language learner at any age, and probably some of the examples of that are I worked once with a 74-year-old Russian speaker who was learning English as a second language. He was very successful, but issues such as related to pronunciation, accent, things like that, those are harder to change as time goes by. There is a theory called the critical period hypothesis that really says that there's a targeted ideal time to learn a language, but a lot of that has been debunked in recent years. Personality factors also influence language learning. We always think about that extrovert as being someone who's really willing to, communicate and is not afraid of communication, but it really depends on the activity. The extrovert may be a better communicator in an oral language situation, while an introvert may be better if they have to do some writing or more introspective work. Extroverts may do better talking to in large groups, while introverts may do better working one-on-one and in small groups. Anxiety is a big personality factor. If you're more anxious, a little bit of anxiety is going to be good for supporting precision, but too much anxiety you're going to shut down. There were some studies related to the use of alcohol to kind of lower anxiety. You can try that this weekend, see if it works. It's been found that, of course, if you do use a little bit of alcohol, it does lower the anxiety, and the performance in foreign language was supported. Don't give anything to your students to drink. You'll get fired. But you may try this out yourself. And as you may be willing to, as you probably know, too much alcohol just ruined the effects of a little bit of alcohol and lowering anxiety. Willingness to communicate is also important. If a student is willing to try out the language in different contexts, with different audiences, that is very supportive of language learning. And attitudes and motivation. Attitudes and motivation is a bit controversial because you think that we want to think attitude is everything. But remember that there's going to be a factor between success and your attitude. So they haven't been able to figure out if this is kind of a chicken or egg thing. If you're more successful and you're getting lots of praise, then hey, your attitude may be pretty positive and you may be a good language learner. If not, so all of those things are on attitude and motivation. If you're unsuccessful and you don't get that praise, or you get too much critical feedback, then that may shut you down, and you may not be a successful language learner. Remember, when it comes to motivation, they've identified two different kinds of motivation. There's instrumental motivation, integrative motivation. Instrumental motivation has to do with, are you learning a language for your job, or for financial gain, or something that has a really immediate impact on you, or do you want to integrate into the society, or do you admire the culture and you want to learn a little bit more about it? And perhaps if you move to France and you're a francophone and you're really crazy about French culture and art and music and food, you may want to be part of that culture, and that will motivate your language learning. But if you're just, there on business and you don't care to be part of that culture, then that's going to also perhaps negatively affect your language learning. So there are a number of socio-cultural factors that influence language learning. Identity and ethnic group affiliation is an important one. Schumann has identified something called the acculturation model. How close do we feel to the target group of language learners? That will influence our language learners. Do we want to be part of that group? Do we see ourselves as completely different, completely foreign? Are we having a hard time making those connections as humans? Then that's a socio-cultural factor that's going to negatively influence our language learning. Learner beliefs is also important, because if the learner, say for example, a learner is used to or expects a lot of feedback and critical feedback, then they may be looking for that in the classroom. A lot of foreign language learners have said that they like that and they want it, but I think that's one of those things that there's a difference between what you're saying and then actually in practice, when you realize that no one's a perfect language producer. And if you really give too much feedback, too much corrective feedback, you could really end up shutting down the student. So I always say the rule of thumb is to focus on meaning. If there's a breakdown of meaning, for example, if the student says something, this is ridiculous, it says something like, "Oh, my mother drove me in the elephant to school today," you would say, "Oh, do you mean elephant? No, do you mean car?" Okay, so that's something you could give explicit correction and support. But if it's just a minor error, you could do something like what Gibbons would call recasting, in which you would say the same thing in the target language, but just in a different way, giving emphasis to what you would like changed in the student's work and the student's production of language. So we've talked quickly about a number of personality, cognitive personality, and sociocultural factors influencing language learning. And there's, as you may have noticed from your readings in Lightbound and Spada and other sources, there aren't any definitive answers to this. There are actually more questions than answers, I think. And I think that's part of the beauty of language learning. Language learning is something that really depends on context and depends on all of these factors happening, not discretely, but all together. So one of the things that's most important is for us to think about is, what does this matter for our own teaching? I'd like you to look at this video I've linked here. And in this video, it shows you a classroom, Lazarus High School in New York, that is focused on supporting English language learners. So some of you may work in an elementary classroom, some of you may be counselors, some of you may be at a high school or beyond. But try to think about what this means to your school climate, and think critically about how, as a community of educators, you can create a space for those students that will be supportive of the psychological, cognitive, and social-cultural factors that are influencing language learning. So watch the video and then we'll move on. So lastly, I'll leave you with this. Some plans to think first of all, self-assess. You're doing many of